Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 13 of the Happy Poly Day series. Today, I'm joined by Morgan, who runs Chill Polyamory, and we're going to be talking about her story of moving from a closed cult to open love. And also, we'll be talking about unpacking shame and shifting beliefs in polyamory. So, welcome, Morgan. It's so great to speak to you. I've followed your content
Hi.
for a really long time. Yeah, so tell us a bit more about what you do on your page.
Sure. My page is Chill Polyamory. I created it first as a way to be visible for a lot of people who don't feel safe being publicly out. I know that visibility has always mattered to me. And over time, I've just started sharing more about practical tools and tips for how to turn theory into practice in your day to day polyamorous life.
Yeah, like I love your content so much because I think like chill polyamory really kind of encapsulates like the vibe of your account. It's always kind of like like pretty patterns and flowers, and you present everything in like such like a like a big sister kind of way. Like I always
Mhm.
like I always feel like so warm, like like watching your videos, and like I'm a very big fan. So yeah, like today we're kind of here to talk about your polyamory origin story. And you have a very fascinating story because you were in a cult at one point, and kind of that experience shaped how you kind of practice polyamory today, right? And so I kind of want to ask you more about that. As I understand it, like this is kind of the first time that you'll be kind of talking about this in a kind of recorded session. And so I'm very happy to kind of let you take the reins on kind of telling the story. If you'd kind of just like to start beginning and tell us how you got to where you are today.
Sure, sure. Well, since it is the first time I'm sharing about it, I hope that it is cohesive and
Yeah.
not meandering. But essentially, I grew up in an environment that was like very, everybody tried their best. I love my parents. And also, there was just a lot of me raising myself, a lot of
Mhm.
being alone, and a lot of insecurity. And I think from day one, I've had an anxiety disorder, but that wasn't diagnosed until my late 20s. And so there was always this like tension and fear around interacting with anybody
Mhm.
socially or romantically. And so, as I got to puberty, I started self soothing and coping with bulimia. Just a lot of like, let me get this anxiety out through purging and then I'll have a calm. And now, obviously, that wasn't conscious. Like,
Mhm.
I just was like, I want to be skinnier. I thought that's what it was about. But underneath that was if I can just control my outward appearance, then I will be accepted, I will be loved, I will be included. And so, there's always this hunger for inclusion and acceptance that never felt satiated. And but because the eating disorder was so violent and disruptive, and I was really spiraling out of control in a short amount of time, my parents were like, we need to do something, we need to send you somewhere.
Mhm.
And so they sent me to an outpatient therapeutic community that was essentially a rehab, but in the state of Florida in America, like there's not a whole lot of rules.
Okay.
Like it's not a regulated industry. You can just say, oh, I have a group home. I have a home for wayward teens, and like just have a bunch of teens come and give you money, and it's a really loose thing. And
Yeah.
so I was moved into this community against my will, very much not interested in it. And my parents were like doing the loving thing, which was like, we're struggling, can you please save our daughter. But yeah, it did take me a lot of years after leaving that community to really unpack that, oh, this actually was a cult. And actually, there's a lot of these around the state and around the nation, and they're just legal enough to not be actionable about like what you're doing is immoral or wrong or harming people or financially abusive.
Mhm.
So
I know you've kind of talked about this, you've alluded to the fact that you were in a cult like on Instagram and on TikTok, but what like I didn't know was that your parents sent you there. And in a kind of attempt to like, like help you or save you or heal you or whatever. But first I want to know, what the cult was like. And like how long were you in it, and kind of yeah, like what happened?
I moved in with this woman. So it's a therapeutically based cult. The
Mhm,
leaders were a family of therapists.
mhm,
And there was one like head leader, and then her children were like, so there was very much like from day one a hierarchy, but it seemed appropriate because I was like, oh, well, they're running this business, they're in charge, they are the people with degrees, right? Like,
mhm,
and then their longest term clients, people who were like going to them for therapy for 10, 20, 30 years, started these group homes to
mhm.
like bring in children to work on drug addiction, like sex addiction, even though I don't really think a child can be a sex addict. But anyway, that's a separate story,
Mhm,
as well as eating disorders. And yeah, so by the time I got there in 2002, there were a couple hundred people that were just in a series of homes. And the whole community was based around going to 12-step meetings, but 12-step meetings run by the community. So, like, very
mhm,
insular, as well as group therapy every day. I was educated at the counseling center. So they were
mhm,
my educators, they were my employers.
mhm,
I was hired by someone within the community for my first few jobs. They were my surrogate parents. They were raising me. They
mhm,
controlled my money. They controlled when and who and where I could spend time.
mhm,
And so yeah, in the beginning, like being very desperate, that seemed again appropriate. Like, okay, well, I'm a minor, so adults are in charge. I'm
mhm,
obviously not good at like running my own life on my own terms, you know? And
mhm,
so even though I went there against my will for the beginning part, the structure of it and people just telling me what to do everywhere felt comforting. Like, oh my God, I'm safe. Thank you for saving my life. You know, like,
yeah,
and I was restoring a relationship with food that was more balanced. And I had people who could like hold me and love me. And it felt like I was home. And
mhm.
that is what is so appealing. Like, nobody says, I want to go and join a cult. People are like, I'm lonely, I'm desperate, I'm failing. Where do
Yeah,
I go? And so the majority, so many people who wind up finding themselves in these abusive relationships,
mhm,
are people who just are having a need for community.
yeah.
And then narcissists will say, oh, great, this could be profitable to me. um,
Okay.
so yeah, so the first couple of years, my parents started feeling like, we're losing her. Like, she's speaking weird, she's dressing weird. Like, I started just assimilating so much because I equated safety and camaraderie and guaranteed friendships with the aesthetics and the behavior of this community. And so it like seeped in slowly, but I was, yeah, I was speaking like a 40-year-old like therapist. Like, I was dressing with pearls and sweaters like from Ann Taylor. Like,
Oh,
I
wow.
was a child that was assimilating into this unofficial uniform and unofficial like way of being in the world,
Mhm,
which was incredibly focused on, like, even though it was secular, a very Catholic kind of purity, no discussing sex, no discussing sensuality, like that was sickness.
mhm,
And the nature of it being all about recovery was that if you did anything that made anyone feel uncomfortable, if you said, oh, hey, you know, like, I'm sexually attracted to this, or like if you had anything that was deviant in any way, you were therefore sick, you were headed to relapse,
mhm,
and the stakes would be artificially raised. I wanted to date a boy in high school, and people were like, you know what, if you go, if you try to talk to him, if you spend time with him against our wishes, you're headed to relapse, you'll be dead in the gutter, you'll be like,
oh
I
my
was a
god.
16-year-old child, like, who had a crush. And so I said, well, let me back up for just a second. They educated me for the first year. I was pulled out of school, but then my parents could not afford to have me stay there full time anymore. I went back to the high school I was from, and that was its own brand of traumatic because high school sucks anyway. But like, I
Yeah.
started as this like very like bulimic girl attempting to look like Britney Spears, and I came back as this very matronly conservative weirdo. Um,
Oh, wow.
so
Okay, that
that
must have been a trip.
It was not my favorite, you know. I still actually am I still am in touch with a couple of sweethearts, some girls that I befriended in high school during that time, who despite all of my weirdness, they're just good people. And
Uh-huh.
so it's been healing to realize like, oh, some people could meet me during that very confusing point and
Mhm.
still see me in there,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
It seeped in as I was getting older, you know, this micromanaging
Mhm.
of my life started
Mhm.
happening. It's like, okay, great. Tell me what to eat, you know, tell me what not to do to avoid dying,
Mhm.
because clearly I was headed towards that, or at least hospitalization. But then once I reached some stability, it's like, well, we don't want, you're never done. You know, you're
Mhm.
never done with therapy. You're never like done. And so there was a lot of like planning out who I should live with. They picked like which roommates I should have. I had to live with people in the community once I moved out. They were very much saying, you need to go to a college that's in Florida. You cannot leave us. You cannot leave this community. You won't be safe. You'll be dead in the gutter. Like they had their their ways of reminding you, like, without us, you will die.
And you
And
genuinely
so
believe that like you
I would
would.
genuinely believe that, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was reinforced because there would always be people who, like, left and
Mhm.
then would relapse with whatever their drug of choice was, and I was like, "That would be me. I absolutely can't relapse, so I can never leave these people." Like, that was always the stakes, but when I finally left later, I was like, "Oh, maybe they're relapsing because they lost everybody they knew and loved overnight." You know, like maybe they
Yeah.
just don't have a fucking support system anymore because you all shunned them and they
Yeah.
turned back to the only coping mechanism they knew.
Mhm.
So,
But that all helped
but
and supported their narrative.
exactly. So it's like, oh, well, if you don't want to die, therefore you should go to the school that we think you should go to and study the thing we should and date and talk to who we think you should. And labeling anyone who was outside of that insular, very puritanical space, labeling them as unhealthy really fucked with me because I was like, that's such a hard thing to argue against.
Mhm.
Someone's
Mhm.
unhealthy for you. Well, you can't, like, if you say someone's a bad person, no, they're a nice person, but if someone will be unhealthy for you, you can't really. I don't know. If
Mm.
I found it very hard to fight back, like, oh, well, you've been right about other things about my health, so maybe I should stop
Mhm.
interacting with this person. So, yeah, a lot of micromanaging of my life. Going back to the thing I said about sex addiction, I was labeled a sex addict at the age of 16. I had never had sex. Um,
What?
so, yeah, basically, I wanted to masturbate and I thought boys were cute. And they
Uh-huh.
were like, this is sick, this is wrong, this is bad. Like, you need to start going to SA. So, at the age of 16, my sex education, because Florida doesn't really have great sex education in schools, my
Mhm.
sex education was Sexaholics Anonymous. I was there um, hearing horror stories of people whose lives have fallen apart because they couldn't stop looking at porn and stuff. And so I got terrified. I got terrified of sex
Mhm.
and really desexualized myself, like wore giant baggy clothes, no makeup, like anything I could do to remove any femininity, to not be attractive to the opposite sex. I was like, this is survival. I cannot be attractive. Otherwise, I will be dead in the gutter. Like, that's always where it went.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah, and this reminds me of, because just before this I was having a talk with Purity to Polyamory, and where like she was kind of talking about purity culture and how like there's a lot of correlation between purity culture and rape culture, and she talked about how like the responsibility of like sexuality is often put in like women's hands, like what you said about like kind of dressing yourself so then you wouldn't appear attractive, you wouldn't kind of tempt people, and kind of seeing like your own kind of form like as like inherently sexual like in some way, and that that fucks with you, and I'm seeing a lot of parallels between like her story and yours, like in that way, like the way that you couldn't just kind of see your body as a body, and we're kind of thinking all kinds of things about like, if I'm attractive then like I'm gonna die.
yeah, I have so many close friends now today who grew up in some kind of evangelical or rigid religious space because we
Hmm.
just have that bond of like, we know how hard it was to come back from that or to
Mhm.
unlearn that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because yeah, shame was so in the air you breathe in those
Mm.
environments. Like,
Mhm.
especially when your brain is literally forming around those environments, it's like,
Mhm.
oh, well, yeah, if I experience any harassment or if I experience any depression, any hardship is because of me,
Mm.
and really, especially what high control groups, which can be a softer term for people who don't feel like cult fits, high
Mhm.
control groups or high coercion groups,
Mhm.
um, they thrive on you not trusting your own intuition and not trusting yourself.
Mhm.
uh, you need to defer executive decisions to the leaders. So that is how that power structure, how that hierarchy stays intact, is making you basically gaslighting you about your own experience. Oh, no, no,
Mhm.
you're not actually attracted to someone. Your addiction is trying to kill you. Like,
Right.
it's very sneaky. It is coming out as an attraction, but really you're not safe,
So
you
you
know?
can't trust your own impulses, you can't trust your own thoughts, and just kind of any kind of like expression of attraction or desire is kind of immediately pathologized.
Absolutely. That's a really
Mhm.
succinct way to say it. It's
Okay.
absolutely pathologized. And I don't think it's just women at all. I think there is a lot of policing of femme bodies, but
Mhm.
there's also so much shame that goes towards men or masculine people of like, you are wrong and sick for your desires, or
Mm.
if you are with a woman or a femme person who has been with other people, therefore you are with a low value person, which makes you a low value person. Like,
Mm.
it hurts everybody. It is just universally
Yeah.
harmful. I don't know what value comes from this other than the people at the top maintaining
Mhm.
control over you. Like, I've never spoken to someone who was like, I'm actually glad that I was taught these shameful things, like,
Yeah.
within the community that I was in, there was healthy people or less healthy people. Your rights within the community would go up the closer to following all of the rigid rules you were.
Mhm.
So, like, the woman that I lived with, I love her. I think I'll always love her. And she was so in the inner circle of the leader of the group. Her husband proposed to her in a therapy session with that woman. Like, it was an infatuation of like, this is the highest form of romance, is to get closer to each other with this woman, like, in our space with us. So um yeah, there were structural ways that being their version of healthy would reward you.
Mhm.
You wouldn't be confronted so much. You wouldn't struggle so much. Like, people would be kind to you. They would invite you to things. So yeah, there was, in the group therapy format, there was so much public humiliation and sort of crowd control directed by the therapist to, like, if you were deviating in any sort of way. Like, one of my roommates wore pink with green, with
Mhm.
colors that kind of clashed, and the therapist confronted her on it, said she was seeking attention, said she was acting out in a deviant way, and then instructed all of her friends to say, like, tell her everything that she's doing wrong, basically. Like, why don't you share your feedback with her about other ways she can improve? But it was just a group attack session because she
Wow.
wore pink and green with each other. And so that's just an example of how intense the attacking of any deviance would
Mhm.
be. Like, let's cut it off at the root, like, let's absolutely make you doubt your own choices around fashion. Therefore, you'll absolutely doubt your choices around who and where and what you do with your time and your
Mhm.
personal life.
Mhm.
Um, so there was such a shaming of any kind of pleasure, to the point
Mhm.
where, like, so I wasn't allowed to have sugar or flour. It's an old, called Gray Sheet for Overeaters Anonymous, old food plan from the 70s that was designed in a very militaristic way and
Mhm.
applied to everybody. Now, OA, they don't really use that gray sheet anymore. It was way too militant.
Hmm.
But this group incorporated this food plan for people who can't stop eating or have a compulsive relationship to eating, to
Hmm.
anorexics and bulimics. And that's the worst thing you can do, because
Right.
cutting out foods and controlling our foods in a really um, moral way of like, sugar is a bad food, quote unquote, that
Hmm.
is part
Hmm.
of our addiction. So I
Yeah.
actually fucking loved it, because I was like, oh great, I can cut out all of these foods, I can like reduce all of the things that I'm eating. And it was just a non-nuanced understanding of how to even help me, even though they claim to know on eating disorders.
Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
to eating disorder treatment since then, where they were like, that's shocking that they did
Yeah.
this, like that's the worst thing you can do.
It's just a different
So
manifestation of like the same stuff, you know, internally, you know, like the anxieties and like the issues that and kind of internal thoughts are still the same, but they're kind of manifesting in different ways, you know, overeating or under eating, it's all kind of eating disorders.
absolutely. And there's some like, your relationship to food is a relationship, a sick relationship to food is a relationship with control. It's all a relationship with emotions that manifests in a self-harming way with food, and that can run the spectrum. But specifically, like being very militant with my diet was part of my sickness, and that was perpetuated in this community.
I actually kind of wanted to touch on, you know, like from what you're saying about like the group therapy and then the kind of like group shaming and all of that kind of stuff. It sounds like there was a lot of community enforced shaming and like kind of humiliation that occurred like in this community. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking, you know, like as a content creator, like I have like a big platform, I constantly have eyes on me, and like that is sometimes anxiety inducing. But like with kind of your background, like particularly when you were in kind of this community where like, you know, like you were being watched and like yeah, like it was like a high control group, like I wonder, you know, how kind of that's kind of shaped like your experiences as a content creator and as a person in general.
Yeah, it's I was incredibly private with my personal life in social media
Hmm.
for most of my adult life,
Hmm.
because of that incredible fear and trauma response of a pile on. Like I
Hmm.
would
Hmm.
see other people like do something that the community at large thought, oh, well, that's the wrong way to speak, or that's the wrong thing to do. And then the casting out of like public shaming, basically. I have
Hmm.
so much shame around public or so much trauma around public shaming. So that I only really dipped into becoming like a public figure when I was like, oh, well, this could be a way to be of service. Like my
Hmm.
desire to be helpful to other people who were struggling outweighed the fear of that kind of treatment. But yeah, I think I still have that. I've gotten a thicker skin. It's actually weirdly been healing to be
Hmm.
so visible
Hmm.
and let people disagree with me and not take that as gospel of like,
Hmm.
I'm therefore a bad person. There's been a little trial by fire with that. I've absolutely had physiological trauma responses to the first time I really posted a video on TikTok. I had so many people on the wrong side of TikTok
Yeah.
commenting about how sick and wrong and bad I am, and actually I'm abusive, or actually I'm an abuse victim, and that shit runs old, like of just like, actually you think you're happy but you're not, you're sick, and let me tell you why, with armchair diagnosing me and stuff. I started dry heaving and getting dizzy and like just having fight or flight responses, and it just took me right back to some really old shit with like feeling safe and then being blindsided by a public pylon. I'm still sensitive to that, and also not really as fearful because I've survived it so many times. So
Yeah.
both are true.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Like you know, I've kind of experienced like pile-ons as well, but you know, obviously kind of I don't have that kind of trauma response, but you know, I still think it's a very distressing experience, so I can't imagine like with that kind of history that you have, like what it must be like for you. So how long were you in this cult, and kind of what motivated you to leave, or what was the kind of point where you suddenly were like, wait, something's off?
Yeah. I was there from the age of 15 to 21. And in short, what motivated me to leave was like the drive to have sex.
Okay.
when I was 18, so a few years before I left, I went on a vacation with my family of origin, to the other side of the world. And physically being out of that community just for a couple of weeks opened my eyes a little bit. You'll see this from a lot of evangelical people who like go to college outside of their,
Mm-hmm.
hometown, and they're like, "Oh wow, you can live differently." Or like, these people who were supposed to be really really sick and bad for me are actually kind of cool. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
get a taste of questioning
Mm.
the narratives that you've always been fed, right? And so I think that planted a seed when I was 18. But I was so fearful of dying that it took a while for that to really germinate. But an important thing that happened on that vacation is I masturbated for the first time since I had entered the community. And I felt so bad about it because masturbation was a relapse and I would have to pick up a white chip in essay. And like, so it was very the high stakes for a teenager to touch herself. So yeah, I had a lot of shame around that. I didn't tell anybody when I returned. And I think that also keeping of that secret, but then realizing I'm actually fine. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the world didn't end. Like, doing the worst possible thing that they told you should never do, but actually like being fine and it's not a huge deal. That
Mm-hmm.
experience was really impactful. So there was a pathway within the community to date somebody that was counselor approved. I had this crush on this boy who was in the community as well, but the genders, very binary, were separated. I wasn't allowed to spend time with guys unless it was a chaperoned environment. So I brought it up for probably about 6 months in a group, women only chat, saying, like, hey, I'm really attracted to this person. I would like to do this the right way. How should I do that? And I kept bringing it up, and they were like, no, 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 now's not the time, or it's not good for that person right now, or it's not good for you right now. And I got very frustrated. I was like, I'm trying to do this the way y'all are telling me I should do it. Like, even if that's just let me talk to him in therapy with you, let me go on a chaperoned date. Like, the path usually was like you go on several chaperone group dates, then you talk about wanting to hold hands, then you talk about a desire to kiss. And when your therapist thinks you're ready, then you can do that. And so it'll take like months or even years before you can actually have sex with somebody in a way that isn't shamed publicly.
Wow.
And
Every step of the way. You have to
every
kind of
step of the
even
way.
talk about, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Right.
and you need to have the therapist approve it and tell you that you're ready, and don't try any kinky stuff because that's sick, like so
Knowing who you are
um
today, that's so funny. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, so I went to college, 20, turning 21,
Hmm.
and saw so many people who I thought were like doing so much worse than me health wise, like people who were using drugs, people who were active in an eating disorder, who
Hmm.
got to have sex. And I was like, this isn't fair.
Hmm.
Like, as a like a repressed kid, I was like, this isn't, like, I'm doing okay, you guys, and you're telling me that I'm gonna die if I have sex, but these people aren't dying. Like, it just was
The math
so
ain't
upsetting.
mathin'.
It ain't nothing. Like, this is really frustrating to me. And so I just kind of I hit a point where I found somebody attractive in one of my classes, and I was like, fuck this. I'm out. I want to go have sex. Like, thank God for sex drive, because I would have absolutely grown into this sort of complacent like mold of a person that they wanted me to be, and never have strived to find out who I really am. So yeah, so I left, but then immediately got terrified and
Uh-huh.
tried to come back a couple of months later. I was like, please let me back. I don't know what I'm doing out here. I don't know how to be a person without you. And the boy within the community that I had had a crush on and tried to talk to for months, one of my roommates was going on a group date with him. And I was like, okay, but I know that takes months to do. So again, the math ain't mathin'. Like, this, you've been doing this behind my back, and like, this is fucked, because the therapist who I was trusting to like put me on this path towards doing it the right way, they were secretly like, there were machinations of like, we actually think she would be a better fit for him, but no communicating of
Oh.
that. So yeah, the fact that they were like, oh, by the way, these two people are going on a group date together, I'm like, the fuck? Because I've been trying to do that for a while. And like, so it hit me of like, this is how it's always been. They have an agenda for who should date who. You're not attracted to somebody, well, we think you should date them. You go out on a date with them now. You are, we don't think you should. You are attracted to somebody that we say no, you know? And
Mhm.
I got so infuriated at just realizing that I would never be able to do it the right way. I would never have agency in my own life in this community,
Mhm.
to pursue what I wanted, even in the
Mhm.
tiniest way.
Mhm.
So I bolted again. I just left. And I think what I'm still like digesting is not only did I think I was going to die, but everybody I loved and had lived with, and all of my best friends, all of my mentors, all of my surrogate family, they thought I was going to die too, and
Mm.
they stopped talking to me. And so that still hits me of just like, wow, y'all were really going to let me die, and I really thought dying was better than staying here. Like, ooh, that still hits.
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, I'm grateful for that turning point. It still took me about a year to finally have sex with somebody because I was terrified, and it took me 2 or 3 years to try alcohol because I was terrified.
Wow.
um and I left in 2007. So
Mhm.
to this day, I still check in with partners. I'm like, y'all don't think I'm an alcoholic, right? Like, I had 2 drinks. Like, that's not a problem, right? Like, I'm still
Wow.
unlearning. Like, no, engaging in pleasure or moderate vices, you're not gonna die from that. Like, you are,
Yeah.
you're,
You're not gonna
you
end up
know.
in the gutter. Yeah.
So learning that shit, like whatever purity culture you're in, like the aesthetics shift, but the mood and the vibe is always the same of like, you can't trust yourself. Any pleasure is wrong and bad. If you deviate from these seemingly arbitrary rules that we've provided, you will have nothing and no one. And then for me, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I had nothing and no one. I overnight was abandoned by like 200 people. And I was fleeing an abusive relationship with 200 people, but then I also was alone. And so I did wind up relapsing with my eating disorder. Again, it was my only coping mechanism. I begged my parents to send me to a different rehab a couple of years after that, and they thankfully gathered all the resources to be able to try to make me do that. So I'm very lucky in that
Mhm.
respect. And I still like think that there's value in 12-step meetings. If I'm ever struggling, I'll drop in on one because luckily that community exposed me to some really helpful tools.
Mhm.
So it's this mixed bag of like, I don't think any controlling or rigid or puritanical environment, I don't think it's all bad. I think
Mhm.
take take what's helpful and leave the rest, and
Mhm.
discovering the lines there is a long process,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that I continue to unpack. But yeah, I think it's helpful to not demonize any particular environment, because then if you do, the minute you have a nice experience in these environments or you meet a nice person, you're like, oh well, they're not demons, therefore uh,
Mm.
this is the everything that they're saying is bad about this environment. That's all false too. It's like, no,
Yeah.
there's all people are people. There will be love, there will be warmth and acceptance, and there will be, in that kind of space, there will be control, there will be invalidation.
Yeah.
um, a couple of people tried to come out as trans when they were teenagers and were completely rejected for that. Like, queerness was completely made to be invisible and invalid and sick and wrong. Like, and that absolutely happens in fundamentalist religious spaces as well. So
Yeah.
when I talk to people who have left high control communities and they're like, oh, but I really love that person, or this mentor was actually really great, I'm like, that's valid too. Like, you
Mhm.
can
Mhm.
have loving experiences and it was abusive. Both can be true.
Yeah,
um
yeah, that's really important to internalize, like, because there's so much nuance with these things. Like, like people often say like you can love your parents and hate your parents at the same time. Like you can have, you can kind of like think back to like a bad relationship that you had and kind of think of like the good times, and they can all kind of coexist, right? It doesn't have to be like black and white, like good and bad, like so, like I apply this to breakups, right? Like, I think there's this kind of weird dichotomy where, with past relationships, we either see it as like it was like this abusive, like no good situation, or like they were like the one who got away. and there's like no in between, right? And then so like we kind of fall into this trap of like with like the relationships that we demonize, you know, we some people kind of might hate themselves for like staying in that relationship for so long, going like, you know, why didn't I realize sooner, like why didn't I just get out of that community sooner, and forgetting that like there were kind of good parts like of that relationship that like, you know, motivated them to like stay for as long as they did. And then equally for the ones where like you glorify and pedestalize the relationship and you're like, oh, they're the one who got away, and you know, like I fucked up, you know, like they then you forget like that there were bad parts of the relationship. There was a reason why you left. There's a reason why you're not compatible and you're not together anymore. Obviously like not entirely the same thing, but then like what you're saying kind of echoes like my personal philosophy about processing past relationships and processing breakups, because I'm very, very careful not to compartmentalize like my exes into like one box and another, and to kind of see them holistically, like as like a whole kind of mix of like good and bad. And I imagine that's kind of how you view that community you were in, you know, like I'm sure like there were parts of it, like, you know, people that you really bonded to, people that you treasured your connections with, and it was also very harmful.
Yeah. And I think when we can accept that about other people, we can also accept that about ourselves. Like, I didn't love what I did that one time. And also, I can have compassion. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a piece of shit. I'm not a terrible person. Like, when we can let go of that binary all or nothing thought process, we can then bring so much more nuance, but also so much more compassion to every situation that we wish went better. Or,
Mm-hmm.
like, we
Yeah,
don't have to ruin our day or ruin our lives or ruin our relationship, because there is also room for improvement. um,
absolutely.
a lot of times people will, like, I'll talk to people and they're like, oh, why am I so controlling? I feel like I'm fucking up this relationship. I wish I wasn't so needy. And I'm like, well, you might have a need. You
Mm-hmm.
might be feeling fear. It sounds like a survival skill that maybe served you at one point, to try and get control of this situation. Maybe, like, growing up, this was the way you coped, and that's valid. And now it's just not serving you in this new context. And both can be true,
Mm-hmm.
just to, yeah, have compassion for the duality of all things. um yeah.
So let's kind of get to polyamory. And
Yeah.
so like did you know that polyamory was a thing like prior to like joining this community, and what kind of made you gravitate towards like polyamory like as a practice, like, you know, after this experience?
Yeah, I learned about polyamory in Sexaholics Anonymous, that
Oh.
it was addiction, just
Uh-huh.
point blank, period.
Mm-hmm.
So feared it, judged it, and also monogamy, or attempts at monogamy, which were all formed after I left because I hadn't dated really prior to that. They were always filled with anxiety and stress, and I either thought I'm going to get bored and cheat, or they're going to cheat on me. Cheating was just always ever present in my mind, of like, this is not possible for me to stay with one person forever. So, like, I felt like really fatalistic that this
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be sustainable ever. And so when in adulthood I was re-exposed to the idea, it was with this community that was really cool and communicative, and, like, I saw it being demonstrably different than addiction. I saw it
Mm-hmm.
being demonstrably attractive, and, like, in a strange way, like, attractive in the same way that the community I was in was attractive, which was like, y'all have each other's backs, and you have a variety of role models, and you have a variety of ways to have your needs met. You're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Like, that's kind of why I liked staying in the cult for as long as I was. Like, I always had like 15 people to call at any given
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that kind of community sense, but without the hierarchy,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
at least in how I practice it, that was really attractive. So, I was terrified going into it. I started practicing it in 2012. I clung to a monogamish aesthetic of like, no, I need to have a primary. Like, I didn't yet know that hierarchy was part of the sickness for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I say for me, yeah, there was a long process of unlearning through learning in the field of like what works and doesn't work in practice, and discovering that, yeah, this is the most sustainable way for me to love, and unlearning the shame that came with assuming I was being in sex addiction. My mom accused me of that not that long ago. She was like, "Oh, well, you're clearly a sex addict." She likes to call me that every other day. So I say that specifically because when people are unlearning shame, it's not like you're just leaving behind the people who taught you those things. You might
Mm,
actively be continuously engaging with people who will reinforce that idea. And it
yeah.
is still possible to unlearn and not internalize those false
Yes.
messages.
Yeah, and to set boundaries, like the whole point of having boundaries is having to enforce them, and it's the enforcing that can be scary because you have to stand up for yourself and kind of face up against people who are going to tell you like no, or that they're disappointed in you.
So yeah, it continues to be an unlearning process. I'm working with a therapist. I finally had the willingness to go see another therapist like 10 years later.
Oh God,
um,
wow.
yeah, it became this real catch-22 of like I need therapy to help with all these therapists. Like so
Oh
yeah,
my gosh.
but I found a therapist who specializes in cult recovery and
Mm,
a therapist who's very anti-capitalist and anti-hierarchy, and like finally found like the right match of a person who gets it.
mhm.
And it has been incredibly healing to actually have a therapist tell me and confirm, you're doing great. It
Mhm.
was sometimes we'll just talk for hours where all she's doing is validating my own ideas and my own choices. And like that is so healing. That is so
Yeah.
healing.
So kind of what attracted you to polyamory was kind of like the freedom and like autonomy and like the kind of lack of like hierarchy, which was kind of like the kind of the sickness, like as you say, like when you were in the cult. But I also find it very interesting that like the community aspects of it like were kind of, you kind of drew parallels like to, when you were in the cult. And that's fascinating to me because like I would have thought, it was going to be one of those things where like you kind of went in the complete opposite direction from like what you experienced, but actually like there were similarities, but they just weren't like harmful similarities. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a hyper independent mode for a long time as a
Mhm.
trauma response of like, oh well, anybody could leave me at any time, trust no one, rely on
Mhm.
no one. I think that's a
Mhm.
common takeaway from people who experience that kind of a thing. So part of the healing is adding more nuance of like, no, community actually is nice. Interdependence with the right people is
Yes.
nice and fulfilling, and so like softening and coming away from that hyper independence was uh, yeah, that took time, but it was really an important part of my healing too.
So apart from kind of deconstructing like hierarchy like in your relationships, like I kind of want to hear more about like, what were your like early struggles like with polyamory, because you not only had to unlearn like a shit ton of mononormativity, but also kind of all the stuff that you had learned in the cult around like sexuality and shame and all that kind of stuff. How did you make that shift, and kind of what struggles did you come across early on, like when you kind of started putting polyamory into practice?
Paying attention to my somatic responses was really important. So, like, I developed a nausea response to anything that I feared. I still
Mm-hmm.
kind of have that. It's not as intense, but like when a partner was kinky, and I both desired exploring that and felt like I was going to throw up. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was really helpful to be like, what is happening in my body right now? Because my brain is glitching out. It's hungry and terrified, but like what's happening? And just like grounding and engaging with cognitive behavioral therapy practices with support of a therapist that can really like make me feel exploratory and curious rather than outright running towards something or running away from it. Just sitting in that discomfort and having the willingness to sit in that discomfort of I don't know. I don't know what I should do next.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great starting point of like taking in information, non judgmentally observing all of the reactions, however contradictory they might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big part of unlearning shame, is just like holding space to be curious,
Yeah.
without condemnation.
I think another thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I because whenever like I have kind of clients speaking to me in kind of peer support sessions, like something that comes up often is like the fear of uncertainty. And you know, like because if you're kind of pursuing an unconventional relationship style, like you're kind of doing everything from scratch, and that can feel very, very destabilizing. And you know, I'm just thinking, particularly for you, like, you know, coming from such like a high control environment and having kind of other people make decisions for you, and you know, like while like you didn't have any agency, like there, I imagine there must have been comfort in knowing kind of exactly what you were like supposed to do. And so I wonder, you know, like moving into a relationship style where like, you know, you had to make all your own decisions, and that like, you know, the only certainty was uncertainty. How did you process that, and what was that like?
Yeah, I think it's why a lot of people stay in cults or high control environments is
Mm-hmm.
because it is so comforting. It's why people are drawn to fascism. Please give me an easy answer and tell me exactly what to do. You know, like that's so soothing. Let me just, be blissfully sleepwalking through my life. So I think I still explore that, being a submissive in kink spaces, like
Mm,
having a space where I can just not be in charge is
mhm,
nice. So
mhm.
that's turned out to be like a more sustainable and compartmentalized way. Like I could never do a 24/7 dynamic. I'm like, been there, done that.
Oh God.
But like, but yeah, like just having an outlet for that, I think that is part of the human experience. We all just want to relax and not think sometimes.
Mhm,
um but yeah, processing this free fall of like, oh, there's no roadmap at all for this,
mhm,
that is scary. But I think because there was no roadmap for just being a person outside of that community, like I felt a sense of familiarity of like, well, I've done this before. Like
mm,
you can kind of rely on your own, like, well, I've survived something that's harder than this and I've
mhm,
figured it out. So, like, in a way, exploring polyamory and designing relationships helped me trust myself more
mhm.
because I was like, well, I haven't died in the gutter yet. So, like, it just, why the hell not? What do I actually have to lose?
Mhm,
So I think while I wouldn't wish my experience on anyone, it did kind of foster a resilience in me that has made this uncertainty of non-monogamy feel doable. Feel like
mhm,
we'll figure it out. I won't be dead by morning. Like that was always kind of grounding of like, let's bring the stakes right sized.
mhm,
Maybe I'll make
mhm.
a mistake. Maybe someone will break my heart. I'm going to keep on living. So let's go and try it. Why
Yeah.
not?
Yeah. um, and so for the kind of last couple minutes of this, I know that you, Morgan, you collated some questions from your followers, and we kind of picked out the most interesting ones, and they're all to do kind of with processing shame, which obviously is your forte. And so I guess kind of we can go through some of those now.
Sure.
So the first one is, how do you handle the shame of relationships ending or evolving or not feeling poly enough?
Yeah. Wow. I think it's really important to check the way that we frame situations. Like,
Mhm,
I don't think it's possible to be poly enough for
mhm,
queer enough for,
mhm,
there's no like gatekeeper saying, yes, you can now enter. Like, if you have the capacity to love more than one person concurrently, you're polyamorous. Like,
yeah,
that's great. Even if you only ever date in straight presenting relationships, but you're attracted to other genders, you're queer. Like, great. It's so to be gentle with ourselves of like, again, avoiding the binary all or nothing. Well,
mhm,
this dynamic is struggling, therefore I shouldn't be here. It's like, no,
mhm, mhm,
it's just struggling. So when we feel ashamed that relationships end, they evolve outside of what we anticipated, that I find value in exploring that verbally with trusted, unbiased third parties, like
yeah,
talking to other polyamorous people who we're not dating,
mhm,
and having that experience validated, because there will be so many monogamous people that we encounter that are like, oh, y'all broke up, therefore polyamory doesn't work. Um,
exactly, yeah, yeah,
it's like, maybe they need it to not be functional because they don't want to explore their own capacity for multiplicitous love. Like, just to talk to other community members,
mhm,
and
mhm,
not
for
feel
sure,
alone because
yeah.
relationships. end or change for a myriad of valid reasons.
And monogamous people also break up all the time, and they don't kind of not feel mono enough. And I think polyamory is some people frame it as a practice, but then as you said, it's like you have the capacity or like the desire, right? Even if you have one partner, or even if you have no partners, like as long as it's about the intentionality, right? As long as kind of that's like your approach, you believe in like the abundance of love, and like the idea that like you can love multiple people concurrently, like that you are poly enough. And we don't have to kind of have multiple relationships to prove a point to people. And I think that like some people can very easily fall into this trap where like because polyamory is so pathologized, and we get so much judgment and like negative comments on a daily basis from like the mainstream. A lot of people like kind of want to prove a point and kind of prove people wrong, and so then they kind of are very like outwardly kind of presenting like with like their multiple relationships, and then and that ends up being quite detrimental. Like if like those relationships end up being unhealthy or just kind of not serving them in some way, you feel like an urge to kind of like hide it because like you don't want to prove your haters right. Like I definitely I covered this with Claire, like when we talked about polyamory and abuse, and how like this desperation to like prove people wrong actually does a disservice to the community, because then we brush like issues like under the carpet. We brushed like toxic behavior and abuse under the carpet because we are so desperate to prove a point that kind of polyamory can work. But the reality is relationships are messy, and non-monogamous relationships are no different. So then I think like yeah, like what you said is very, very true. I think like relationships end like when they need to end, and there's no shame in that. Like I think also just there's no shame in a breakup. Like if sometimes like a dynamic kind of that's kind of what best serves the two of you, then it is what it is. And I think you'd be doing even more of a disservice to yourself by staying in a relationship just for the sake of it, to prove a point. Because then who what point are you proving? Who are you proving it to? I think we have time for one more. So any thoughts on feeling ashamed or guilty because you fear you're just chasing love and affection?
I often felt that way. I was like, oh, well, I'm just a lonely, sad piece of shit, like who just like can't
Get
commit
enough.
to. Yeah, I can't get enough, or I fear commitment, but I just always want to be fed. Like, again, checking the narrative that you're accepting as truth. Like, just because you desire love, like you're a human being.
Mm-hmm.
We're social creatures. We want camaraderie. We want affection. That's natural. That is not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who might have told you it was wrong, maybe investigate like who gave me this idea that it was
Mm-hmm.
wrong to have needs or to have wants. Because when we accept it as truth of like, oh well, I'm just needy, I'm insatiable, we have to challenge those narratives, because that's a judgment, that's not a fact, it's not an emotion, that is a condemning thought that might not be rooted in reality, but be rooted in some sort of shaming narrative that somebody gave us a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess whenever I have those self-condemning thoughts, I inquire further, like, like approach with curiosity. Where did
Mm-hmm.
this come from? When did it start? Why do I think that? Would someone else think that about me? Let
Mm-hmm.
me ask them actually and be vulnerable and say, like, do you judge me for this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, checking our notes, like, one of the most empowering things to do is to like speak back to our internal critic and be
Mm-hmm.
like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, and not associate it as inherently ourselves, inherently our voice, inherently true.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, this narrative might have been given to me, which means it can be taken away. It might have been learned, which means it can be unlearned.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I think it's valid to want all the love in the world,
Yeah.
because you're a
Yeah.
person. That's great. Sounds
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah. And I think also from a practical perspective, if someone is really worried that like they are kind of just constantly chasing the high of love and affection, and because there is like a certain type of person that is constantly kind of chasing NRE, and then kind of just like
Mhm.
kind of repetitively kind of just like only staying in relationships for as long as like they're passionate, and then kind of jumping ship. If you're worried about that, I would kind of take stock by having a look at you know, like, are you hurting anyone? Are you like hurting yourself? Like, you know, are kind of, is what you're doing like serving, you know, like your like overall, I guess, overarching goals? And also like correct me if I'm wrong, right? But like an addiction is only an addiction if it starts like really negatively kind of impacting other areas of your life. You know, it's one thing to kind of chase like, you know, like love, affection, sex, or whatever, but if it starts kind of getting to a point where like it's disrupting like your work or like your sleep or like your eating habits or like whatever, then that's kind of where it starts being like, you know, perhaps like a little bit unhealthy. Um, that's kind of my personal take on it anyway.
Absolutely. I think that's a helpful thing to point out, is that if you're pursuing affection and love to your own detriment or to the detriment of others, and that is tangible, you can point to harm caused, then inquire further still, like, but maybe
Hmm.
with a professional if they're accessible to you.
Hmm.
What am I
Hmm.
running away from? What am I hoping this will fix?
Mm,
Those are helpful questions, because desiring love is great. Wanting a lover to fix us or fix something is not sustainable in my
mhm.
experience. So,
Yeah.
yeah, checking motivations is always helpful, I think.
Yeah. Well, this has been such an amazing chat, Morgan, and thank you so much for being like so vulnerable with me. I imagine it must have been very difficult to kind of tell this story. So where can people find you and your wonderful work on social media?
Thank you so much. Yes, it was scary to have the talk, but I trust you and I love everything you do. So, yeah, I feel like it was a good space to talk about it. Um, I can be found on Instagram and TikTok at Chill Polyamory. I post weekly resources and offer pen pals on patreon.com/chill polyamory. And I also chat with people for peer support, big sister vibes, on chillpolyamory.com. You can book a chat with me there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your work, Morgan. And I hope to collaborate more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.